Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt inside the Beltway. I began the show by reading you the headline from the Wall Street Journal: Ukraine's troops fight war of ambush and skirmish. I also told you that President Biden is going to sanction hundreds of Russian lawmakers, according to U.S. officials, every member of the Duma, and that Jake Sullivan yesterday said the president's trip to Brussels is intended to bring the European allies together to escalate sanctions on Russia. Will that work? Congressman Mike Gallagher of the House Intelligence Committee, House Armed Services Committee, joins us. He's, of course, from Wisconsin. Saw the beautiful little Gallagher girl on Special Report last night, Congressman.
Well, I'm blessed. When you marry someone so far outside of your league, it's good when she takes after her mother. So it was a very cute moment.
It was a cute moment. Brett had fun playing that. I thought it was terrific. Now, what do you expect out of the president's trip, or hoping for? What's the best case that could happen at the gathering in Brussels that they're assembling today? They meet tomorrow.
Well, the best case would be for the president to inject some urgency into fixing the MiG-29 fiasco. And if that is not possible, at a minimum, finding a way to take Slovakia up on its offer to provide the S-300 system to the Ukrainians, provided that we can somehow backfill them with Patriots from Germany. I know that it's complex. I know that it might require us to gap some air defense systems in other parts of Europe, but I think we can and we must get that done. And with the full support and urgency that the Office of the Presidency can bring, I believe it's very possible. Now, the bigger and more ambitious idea would be to somehow get the Turks to provide their S-400 systems to the Ukrainians. And the reason this is so intriguing to a lot of us, Hugh, is that not only is it a way to provide critical lethal assistance to the Ukrainians, it's also a way of getting our NATO allies to divest of legacy Russian systems that have been an impediment to enhance cooperation. I mean, the reason we have a hold on the sale of things like F-35 to the Turks is not just because of human rights concerns in the Erdogan era. It's because they have purchased these Russian weapon systems. So if the president could somehow harness this renewed spirit in NATO to help the Ukrainians to also modernize its defenses and get rid of certain Russian weapon systems, that to me would be the best possible outcome of this trip. Now, we'll see what happens. We still have massive holes in our strategy, particularly the energy component, both the energy gaping hole in our sanctions regime and the fact that Russia continues to make over $1 billion from European energy sales in particular, but also our just completely counterproductive domestic energy policy here in America. I have no hope that the president is going to change course on that. He remains beholden to the progressive left and the climate change cult, and that's really causing serious concerns for our national security.
He's leading from behind again, and there is no other way to explain it. He has been late on everything except, I'll give him credit, he led on sanctions on Russian oil and gas because the United States doesn't use much, and Europe is sketchier on this, but I'm hoping he rallies people on this. Yesterday, General Jack Keane said on this show, we've got to erase the distinction between offensive and defensive weapons. Everything is a defensive weapon when your country is besieged. And he also wondered where the anti-ship missiles. Can you answer those two questions? One, is that distinction relevant anymore, or has it been removed? And two, where are the anti-ship missiles? They're killing Mariupol by sea fire.
Well, on the distinction, I think on your show before, I've said the distinction makes absolutely no sense. I mean, it's entirely context dependent, right? A bayonet, I guess, could be a defensive weapon if the enemy is overrunning your foxhole. It could also be an offensive weapon if you are trying to overrun the enemy's foxhole. So the distinction has never made any sense to me other than, it's a way for academics sitting in air-conditioned offices in D.C. to, justify certain policies or that they might fear are escalatory. And I will say on that point, Hugh, my biggest concern with our approach to Ukraine right now with the Biden administration is they're so dominated by their fear of escalation, their fear of provoking Putin, that I think they fail to see that fear itself is provocative. And I would argue further, the reason we got into this situation in the first place is because we allowed the fear of provoking Putin to dominate all of our actions. We need to be putting fear into Putin's brain and make sure that he is the one who fears escalation. We should be cognizant of the risks of escalation, particularly nuclear escalation, but we can't allow it to dominate our thinking as we try to help the Ukrainians going forward.
Am I correct, Congressman, that everything the United States has done since Russia invaded, you and others in the Republican Party urged that we do before they invaded in an effort to deter them?
Well, we failed, I would say, Hugh, if I understand your question, for what, the better part of 6 years to do everything possible prior to the collapse of deterrence to help the Ukrainians. And that was a bipartisan failure. And you could say that part of this just got caught up in the complex bureaucracy that is both the Pentagon and the intelligence community, but that's not an excuse. That should be a wake-up call that we need to modernize our defenses, particularly if Ukraine offers us an opportunity to forge a sensible middle path between an all-out, go-it-alone, massive infusion of U.S. military resources and troops on the one hand, and an isolationist, Fortress America, look inward, go not abroad in search of monsters to destroy strategy on the other hand. We've learned in Syria, in Iraq, in other places that if we act as an enabling force for allies and partners on the ground that are willing to fight ferociously for their own country and for their own interests, we can have a massive effect while still maintaining a light footprint. But we still are not comfortable yet fully with operating that way, and we still have massive problems within our national security bureaucracy that we need to iron out. And finally, Hugh, I would say what we've learned is that sanctions alone, non-military instruments alone, are not enough to deter, particularly when you're dealing with a brutal thug and dictator like Vladimir Putin. The specific form of deterrence that the Biden administration is arguing for, what will be the cornerstone of their national defense strategy, something called integrated deterrence, involves the elevation of non-military tools over hard power. It is a dangerous concept, and it is a concept that has now specifically been tested in Ukraine and has failed. Deterrence failed in Ukraine, and yet multiple Biden administration officials, when questioned by me in the Armed Services Committee about whether they view this as a success, have confirmed that they view the situation in Ukraine as successfully validating their entire intellectual foundation for the forthcoming national defense strategy. And we need to be very wary of that, Hugh, because that is the wrong direction to go in.
That's so stupid. That's so Aspen Institute, Davos, seminar room, exactly. College faculty lounge, unreal. Let's go to the reality of Mariupol, where integrated deterrence has resulted in a desert. So they made a desert and they called it integrated deterrence, to borrow from whoever said that about the Romans in Carthage. What is the best outcome here that you can foresee, Congressman Gallagher?
Well, I worry that now that the Russian blitzkrieg has failed, we're now settling into attrition warfare, and that's where the Russians could be more successful. They have basically three different wars going on in the country right now. Two are somewhat stalled, and one is advancing. In the south is where I'm most worried. I think they could continue to consolidate their gains, make incremental gains, and ultimately make sure that any negotiated settlement includes a demand for a land bridge from Crimea to Russia, which would be a massive gain for the Russians. The two dogs that haven't barked thus far that I suspect will bark very soon, one is Belarus getting involved and invading from the northwest, which would be very problematic for the Ukrainians and cut off their supply lines. And the other is Putin using cyber weapons, possibly even against the United States. President Biden warned of that. We need to be very wary of that. And the fact is, as I learned in co-chairing the Cyber Solarium Commission for 2 years with Senator Angus King, we are very vulnerable domestically, particularly when it comes to our critical infrastructure. Think your local utility, water, power, things like that. That is really where we are vulnerable. And if this continues to go on, as much as the administration might content itself to think they're bleeding Russia dry, or the Ukrainians are bleeding Russia dry, we could still be very vulnerable here on the homeland. So those are just some things to watch for that worry me. And again, it comes down to this basic proposition that for Putin, human life is cheap. So he's willing to sacrifice a lot of lives so as to stay safe, as well as to, carve out at least half of Ukraine. We need to put Zelensky in as strong a position as possible if and when he chooses to pursue a negotiated settlement.
So last question, Congressman. We used to have mutually assured destruction, and that still works for the nuclear side. But on the cyber side, we need MACD, mutually assured cyber destruction. Do you think NATO will join us in stating clearly that Article 5 applies to cyber attacks?
I don't right now. But one thing we do recommend in the Cyber Solarium Commission is to have it clarify our signaling policy as well as our response policy along the lines you suggest. Ambiguity might work in some areas, but not when it comes to cyber. And furthermore, Hugh, where we really need to work in partnership with NATO is to go on offense. We're not nearly where we need to be in terms of launching offensive cyber operations with the rapidity that we need to launch them. And in some cases, it's more difficult to get offensive cyber operations approved than it is to get lethal drone strikes approved, which makes
that's crazy. Sense. No, whatever they hit us with cyber-wise, we ought to hit them 5 times as hard. And the Russians might have a very good GRU unit doing this, but they ain't got the NSA and the European allies. Last question, the anti-ship missiles. Now, I'm told Harpoons are not the world's greatest weapon system, but if they're shelling Mariupol into nothingness, isn't at least shooting at the ships worth something, Congressman?
It is, but it gets to this, and I quite honestly don't know where we are with the shipment. It's something we need to, when we get back into D.C. next week and we're having hearings, we need to look into. But it gets to this broader issue where, from the start, we basically abandoned the Black Sea. We just abandoned it, and the Russians have dominated it ever since. The Russian presence in the Eastern Med has really picked up. So the naval aspect of this has been a complete surrender, and that's very problematic, Hugh. We should have had naval assets in the Black Sea. We could have had an influence. We could have had a deterrent effect on the ground in Ukraine if we had not abandoned the Black Sea.
I agree. Congressman Mike Gallagher, thank you as always. Rep Gallagher on Twitter, at Rep Gallagher. Every week he brings us up to speed, and we didn't have to have any Packers talk this week, thank goodness.